Aloha, Maui Mamas, and welcome to the CoronaMama Zoom Room. This show is brought to you by the Maui Mama magazine, and we are here for you, the Maui Mama, to express and to connect and to share all those things that are on our minds during this pandemic time. Our motto is #share aloha and not corona. I'm Angeline Chu Longshore, and today we are talking about pandemic misinformation. This is a topic that is really a juicy one, and we'll walk you through how to think critically about coronavirus, COVID-19 pandemic, and anything related that you come across. But first, for our Actions of Aloha segment, Megan Miller is a Maui mom who stepped up in the Maui Mommies community to lead a free outdoor experience for our little ones, and it's called Forest School, helping moms and dads to get their little ones outdoors. And so we will see more of her and her Forest School at the end of the show. Okay, so a little bit of housekeeping. I just wanted to let you know that if there's any organization or business that wants to sponsor this show, then DM me on Facebook or get in touch with me through the Maui Mama Magazine Facebook page. All right, so now we are talking about another pandemic that is actually caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is what researchers are calling a pandemic of misinformation. And the truth is that we are all not immune to falling into some kind of information that's being floated around, right? And the reason is because that we want to protect our families and our friends. So when we see that bit of like a golden nugget that we think, ooh, that's so good, I've got to share this. Well, that's natural. That's actually normal. And so research shows that historically, during pandemic times, this is just a byproduct of natural disasters. This is totally normal. And so we shouldn't blame ourselves or blame other people or look critically at them like they're so horrible. It's just natural. And the reason for it is that researchers say that people try to make sense of uncertainty to alleviate anxiety. And that makes sense, right? We're just trying to get a handle on things. So what happens is there's this rumoring, and that is part of trying to make sense of it all. And the rumors, of course, they can be false, but actually sometimes they can be true. So that just kind of confirms to people, yes, we have to, try to figure this out and maybe spread this information. So that's why they're calling it a pandemic, because it is being spread worldwide, all this misinformation. So I wanted to read you a few studies. There's one from the Center for Informed Public at the University of Seattle, Washington. And they say that this process is helpful because it helps us to take actions and make decisions based on understanding what's happening. And that totally makes sense, right? We have to take in this information because we need to know how to operate our lives during this pandemic time. And then another research at MIT says that emotion really makes people less discerning. So people closer to the epicenter of the incident, of the happening, they are going to share information more readily that may be false. And it may be true or it may be false, but they will just share regardless because they are just so heightened with emotions that they are not thinking clearly. And then something from Harvard EDU. I'm going to read this to you. When a disease outbreak grabs the public's attention, formal recommendations from medical experts are often muffled by a barrage of, they say, half-baked advice and sketchy remedies and misguided theories that circulate as anxious people rush to understand a new health risk. And that's what's happening in this current crisis. And then the sudden onset of a new highly contagious coronavirus, it's what the UN Secretary Antonio Guterres says, it has unleashed this pandemic of misinformation. And so 2/3 of Americans say that they have seen news and information about the disease that seemed completely made up, according to a recent Pew Research study. And this sheer volume of COVID-19 misinformation and disinformation online is actually crowding out accurate public health guidance. So that's why this is dangerous, because we are paying attention and spreading information that is not accurate, and we're not listening to the public health guidance because we're hearing much more of that other. It's just inundating us. And the intentions could be, it's an honest mistake of the people writing it. Or, some people say like, eat a lot of garlic or gargle with salt water if you think you're getting COVID or have, a scratchy throat. And those are honest intentions. But then there's actually intentions that are meant to mislead people. And so there's disinformation campaigns. Usually, this article is saying, for political gain, that falsehoods are spread deliberately. And then what's happening with the media is, even in the mainstream media, this research is saying it's added to this misinformation problem, because the reporters and editors with no medical experience or public health training, a lot of them were reassigned because of the onslaught of news coming out, that there were not enough of the people that were trained to cover it. So these journalists have good intentions, and they're relying on their traditional journalistic values, which is relying on a balanced story or novelty or looking at the conflict. And they're not actually understanding fully the research themselves. So that's why this is happening. So because of all of this, and I was thinking about misinformation and how dangerous it is, I reached out across the Pacific Ocean to a sociologist in Australia, because she wrote an article that caught my attention, and it was about COVID misinformation. And she wrote this article because she saw that her friends and her family were falling for all these different things that were fully falsehoods. And so she thought, okay, I need to help them to really understand how to walk through any information, whether it's an article, a YouTube video, or something posted on social media, so they can really think through critically what they're looking at. So I interviewed her last night, and so let's bring her interview in to the Zoom room. Hi, Zuleyka. Welcome to the CoronaMama Zoom room.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, you're coming all the way from Australia.
Yes, Sydney.
Oh, cool.
Where it's daytime.
So introduce yourself to us and tell us what you do.
Sure. So I'm a sociologist, and I do, as part of my paid work, I am a researcher for social policy. And in my spare time, I actually write about sociology for the public.
Okay, so that's where I came across your article. So your article was a little bit off your normal studies that you do, and it was about using sociology to think critically about coronavirus studies. And so tell me, what led you to write this article?
So it was a reflection of what I had been seeing for a while since the pandemic broke out. So obviously in Australia, like in many different places, we were seeing media reports coming out of China about how the pandemic had spread there. And then it obviously spread here in Australia. And I just saw a lot of confusion amongst my friends and family. And so my family network is as diverse as probably for many other people. So I am Peruvian, I'm a migrant, and we're working class, but obviously I've got friends who are professional as well. But I was seeing these sort of patterns in lots of different people, regardless of what they do for a living. And I was just seeing, so several things were striking me that led me to think I really need to start doing something about this, given what I know as a sociologist. And one of the first things that was coming to me is just the level of confusion amongst my friends and family. So the directions about how to follow social distancing, what should we do to protect ourselves from getting infected, was changing all the time. And this has happened around the world because what we're seeing is unprecedented. So everybody is experiencing what it's like to do science in real time. So usually when we're trying to study a phenomenon, we are constantly asking new questions, new data comes along, so we revise our recommendations, our conclusions. And because this is a pandemic that is completely new, that's why it's a novel coronavirus pandemic, the information is constantly changing. So the other issue is that, like in many countries, Australia has a difference. The federal government looks after aspects of the health care policies, but at the state level, they're in charge of hospitals and the actual healthcare services. And so these two levels of government at the beginning were giving completely different information, and people weren't sure what to believe.
We have that in the US
and
too.
So, yes, and that's why you see in the United States and in other countries, including Australia, where some states are really struggling, and they have very high rates of infection and death rates, which is happening as well here, because different states have different infrastructure, and they've been following different advice. So eventually things did come together, but in Australia it actually meant that the federal and state governments needed to reach a new agreement about how they were going to coordinate. So it was quite unprecedented that they had to set up a new form of governance quite quickly, and it was to deal with these conflicting information. And so I was just seeing my friends and family, as you probably would have been as well, debating things like early. You might remember that there were a lot of debates about masks. You know, do they help? Do they not help? Should we wear them? What type of mask?
In the US, it's still a big thing of people who are anti-mask or pro-mask. So unfortunately, it's still a thing. There's a lot of confusion.
So the confusion is partly driven by politics, let's be honest.
Yes,
but it is,
sure.
but it's also partly driven by the science. So at the beginning, the World Health Organization was not recommending mask use. The reason for that is because we know from other scientific research, including behavioral research, which is what I do as my day job, sometimes when we're trying to get people to change their behavior and do something completely new that they're not used to, we have to think about what is the optimal outcome, and if we introduce new things, will that lead to maybe some adverse outcomes that we weren't expecting. So with masks, first of all, because it's a new virus, we actually didn't know fully how it spread. And you'll remember that early on, people were comparing it to the flu. And it's not like the flu. We know that absolutely now. But this is why scientific organizations, including the World Health Organization, they wanted to collect data about what type of mask and will masks actually help. And so early on, what was evident is that aspects of social distancing made the biggest impact to stop the spread of infection, and that was washing your hands, as you know, for at least 20 seconds, keeping our physical distance from other people, and observing some of the other rules that are now commonplace, but they weren't at the beginning. And so it sounds silly to some, but washing your hands for 20 seconds, that in itself, such a simple behavior, as you know, has taken a lot of new socialization because we're not used to it. We're not used to constantly washing our hands. And interestingly, actually, there's a lot of research showing that, you know, in healthcare, where they're very, very busy, and they are used to understanding why you need to regularly wash your hands, they also needed some coaching around this as well. So when we were governments were trying to get people to follow social distancing rules, there were new norms. We're not used to doing it. We're not used to being far away from people. We're not used to not hugging our friends and colleagues when we see them. And so it was, we were trying, the policymakers wanted to, and health experts wanted to correct for something that's known as the backfire effect. So Other research shows that if we were trying to initially get people to wash their hands, so that's one of the big key behaviors, and keep distance, would masks actually lead to people then not washing their hands as frequently and getting a little bit lax? So this is where science is kind of evolving, because the World Health Organization wanted to commission, this is what they did, they commissioned research, and then they were able to give us probably about a month or two ago conclusive evidence that actually these are the types of masks that help. And yes, wearing it is conclusive that wearing at least a cloth mask is better than no mask at all. And just watching those behaviors, like we need to keep seeing whether people wearing masks might lead to them thinking, well, that's my protective barrier, maybe I don't need to stay the full 1.5 meter distance. So when ordinary people like my family and your friends and your audience, when we're hearing this conflicting information and we don't understand how science is, then it kind of leads to, you would have seen a lot of people kind of leads to misinformation and conspiracy theories. I've seen a lot of, even my friends who are very educated, talking about, well, why didn't that World Health Organization tell us from the very beginning if they knew all along? It's a conspiracy. And it's not a conspiracy, it's just the nature of science, that when we're going to do public health initiatives, we need it to be evidence-based.
It's so interesting because the fact that the layperson does not know how it normally works and how long it takes to go through the full research studies. And it's not just one study, there's multiple studies and I can't even remember all the words that I did cover medical news for a while, but if they don't know how long it takes and all the different things that it involves, then of course they're going to say, well, we're getting all these different things, so there must be something behind it. It's sort of this suspicion because there's such an unknown, and then we're in this survival mode of fear around the information, and people like to sort of grasp onto what they know, and it's like to maintain control, it seems. Isn't that right?
Absolutely. This is a time that people are afraid, and people want what's best for themselves and their family. We keep seeing behaviors that are a problem, where people are purposefully not following social distancing. And now that we know that masks are important, we do see people who talk about it in terms of human rights. It is not a human right to to not wear a mask. But for example, those people wouldn't understand that there are policies in place. So every government around the world have laws already in place that actually override individual freedoms. And I think people don't always understand how social policies are generated, why they exist, and how they impact our lives. So because we are now currently living, everybody globally, through a pandemic, it's kind of brought these issues to the forefront, where actually, even in democratic countries, the law can force us to stay home. The law can compel us to wear a mask. And the individual rights that we have don't apply during a pandemic. That's what public health orders are about. And I think what we're seeing is people not used to dealing with these dynamics in certain countries like Australia and the United States. However, if you look at other countries who have lived through various pandemics and epidemics, they are more readily able to follow and shift and listen to direction. So in some Asian cultures, they already are socialized to wear a mask because it's considered respectful to not spread your germs. And I think many people would have seen this when they visit other countries, but they were basically already primed. So when some of these countries, and they'd already been through SARS and other epidemics recently, and so they were ready. Their people were ready, the infrastructure was ready, and this is why Wuhan and other provinces that were initially had a high rate of infection were able to control it a lot quicker than some other countries, and why second waves of the infection are affecting some regions of the world, but not necessarily others.
Mm-hmm. When I think about the difference of the interdependence versus the interdependence is Asian cultures really do care about each other so much more because they're typically multi-generationally living together. They depend on each other just culturally in a different way. And then the US, that American spirit of freedom, we are based on kind of being rebellious and being really taking our freedoms to heart. And in your unbiased from a different country's opinion, does it seem that because of this idea of freedom that we are actually worse off spreading the disease based on these ideals that we have?
I do think that if you look at the responses of different countries, culture is having a major impact on policy, as well as how different public health orders are being managed and how individuals are reacting. So in countries like the United States, which has a very specific history of colonization and a specific story that many people tell about what it means to be American, which is, as you described it, to be a bastion of personal freedom. And it does lead to some of the protests that we're seeing globally, particularly say in the United States, where people are kind of talking about their personal freedom to not wear a mask, or we are seeing obviously many videos of individuals being very angry when shops are trying to enforce public orders. So they're doing the right thing. And then you see these people defending their right to not wear a mask or their right to breathe, which is very different to other countries. So the interesting thing is national cultures, even the myths that we tell about our different national cultures are impacting how governments are able to control the infection. So in some countries where people have a high trust of government, like the Netherlands, like Scandinavian countries, where they haven't had a pandemic recently, but they have a far higher trust in their public officials. And so when they get directions, they are more likely to follow them. So those countries have also had very different approaches and therefore different outcomes. So for example, if many countries have used SMS as one vehicle for governments to communicate their public health orders. I don't know if you've had that in Hawaii, where you've had text messages about the infection from the government.
We only have it for like emergency services, but not.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's because of the fears of Big Brother-ish idea that if it's in your phone, then they know where you are and they're spying on you. So in a way, a conspiracy theory mindset where maybe that actually would be helpful. But, there's, I guess, that idea. So that doesn't play over well with people. And so they're reticent to actually do that.
Very interesting, because a lot of countries have been using SMS and apps to help their citizens be prepared for the current wave as well as potentially future actions. So when the government in the Netherlands, for example, they have been sending out texts, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, just giving directions about what was happening and what they needed to do to prepare. And people don't have that reaction you just described. People are just used to their government having their best interests at heart. It's not that everybody loves the government, it's that the trust is far higher. and that they're more likely to therefore follow those directions. In Australia, we're probably in between, where there have been text messages used to inform the public. And interestingly, the federal government created an app, which has been, it's a version of an app that's been used very successfully in other countries, including Singapore, to give people advice about, and in particular to track when they're out and about. It captures information about where you are and the people around you. And if lots of people around you, you're probably familiar with this, who have the same app, then should you be exposed to infection, you'll get an alert on your phone.
And that's a wonderful thing. We don't have that. And I believe it's called geofencing. That's something that has been talked about just recently in Hawaii for the hotel resorts, so that if we had visitors, that they could have sort of a wristband that would allow them to utilize all the services, like that's the positive, the services within the resort, and other people can't come in to use them, but it also detects if they are getting closer to the borders where they're not supposed to be, going outside of the hotel bubble. It's a resort bubble they're talking about doing, to help the economy, to bring in tourists, but do it safely. And so I think the mindset for our governmental leaders is that they want to utilize things where we feel like we're being protected but not abused, just the surveillance or the any kind of our rights are being taken away, or we're being spied upon. And all of those are really big fears, and there's very big camps that are divided with that. And I would say we haven't had a top-down leadership that has been giving us a clear message of, here's how we do this together. And so in a sense, like you were saying, your government, state and federal came together. Well, our federal has said, you states figure it out. And I'm not wanting to be political here, but that's just the fact of it. And so every little state is scrambling, while each area hotspots are rising for different reasons, and we are able to cross borders. So it doesn't, there's not that overarching umbrella that's helping us to maintain something so that we could just flatten the curve altogether. And then there's one that pops up here and there, and so it can, and then people can cross borders wherever that is to spread it. So it's really interesting how our culture really determines so much. I mean, there's a reactionary back and forth from the freedoms and the belief systems and the policy that is actually put in place. And I find that fascinating, because there's too many people that would react. So they're not going to do the geofencing nationwide. They're too afraid to do that. And then federally, it's sort of hands off in a sense. And I'm not going to say why or get into that, but that's just how it is. So it's so interesting. In each state, they are doing what that particular governor, or even our mayor is in Maui, is having some different thoughts of the mayor in Oahu. And, and so each of us can look to our leader, and there's all these different ideas. And so fortunately, Hawaii has sort of come together with Governor Ige, and they've had discussions together to really coordinate. And that's not happening nationwide, though. So we're lucky that we have an ocean, which is a little bit of a border. I mean, it's a big border that, that we can, for some part, keep people out, but not for so long. And we do depend on each other, as we do worldwide, because we are going to eventually open up again one day worldwide. And we have to, I think, take care of each other. But then we have these cultural issues.
It's so interesting. It's so interesting because you've touched on exactly public health. So with a pandemic, it makes zero sense for countries, regions within countries or states to have different practices, let alone around the world. That's why it's a pandemic. The pandemic is the definition from health science is about the whether a disease, how fast it can spread. So it's not necessarily about death rate, although now this has become, we know that it's more lethal than the Spanish flu, which is another global pandemic that had a large impact. So it makes, and one of the things that the World Health Organization and other international scientific agencies have said over and over is that we need to coordinate together as a one. And it's interesting because globalization has been a fact for decades now, through the ease of travel and changes to national laws around travel, and the ease at which we can travel. And it's interesting because if one country beats COVID-19, that's great. But as you just mentioned, if they ever want to open up and stimulate the economy effectively without another wave of infection, it matters what the country beside them is doing, what the country across borders is doing. So I think all of this leads to confusion, and it's really a time for us to rethink whether we are as individualistic as we say we are, and what are the costs. So when you describe the individualistic norms of America, which is completely, what dominates national culture, it's amazing that healthcare it's set up in American system that healthcare is not it's not a universal right. And so we're seeing these patterns in the United States and elsewhere. People, so in Australia, we do have universal healthcare, which is very different. I think that also positions us to respond differently to the pandemic. However, if you're a working class person, a poor person, your access to healthcare is different. Mm-hmm. And here, we are seeing the second wave, which is much more lethal than the first wave. So the first wave was when people were returning from overseas. Now, more people are dying, particularly in the state of Victoria, especially in healthcare. It's older people, that fountain of knowledge that so many families rely on. So many older people are dying, and the highest rates of infection are amongst first responders, health workers, people who are precariously employed. So they're working in aged care homes, they're working in hospitals. They don't have the same protections. They don't have the same rights as, say, someone like me. I work in an office and I have access to sick leave, but they don't. It's a casualized workforce. So even here, where we have universal healthcare, the way in which that happens on the ground at the everyday level is having an impact. As in America, the really big cities, the patterns there are Los Angeles and New York. It's primarily Black and other Hispanic and other racial minority people who are being infected. And it's because they do, they're the frontline workers. They're the people who are really
they must work,
delivering the services that we need. They have to work. And if they don't work, more people get sick, right? It makes no sense that their rights aren't protected, that their individual rights aren't being protected. In Australia, we are now currently having an inquiry into how the first wave has happened. And now we're going to need an inquiry about what led to the second wave, because the casualization of the healthcare workforce is responsible for the spread of the second wave here and in other places, certainly in America as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, hopefully people, because we still have controllable numbers, hopefully people can think about what you're saying and realize that it can be a small group of people that can completely start spreading it. I mean, we've heard it's exponential in the spread, but in the actions of just a group of people, a small group of people can make a difference. Yeah. And I wanted to get into the part about the article that you wrote and how people just take in this information that they read, and out of fear and out of what they've heard and what their friends are thinking, they extrapolate that this is the truth and they glom on to that. And I think you've talked about that in your article as confirmation bias. Can you explain that?
Sure. So confirmation bias is an idea that describes how when people have very rigid opinions about the world, and we all have them about different things, but when we feel very strongly about one particular belief, rather than looking to grow our mindset, grow our awareness of underlying causes and issues and look broader than what we know, confirmation bias is where people do the opposite and instead will look for information that confirms their belief rather than disproves their belief. So it's different for different people, but certainly we see it a lot in health. People have very strong ideas about vaccines, for example, or they have very strong opinions about as we talked about, their idea of rights, which is a very narrow definition of what it means to have individual rights. And so instead of thinking, let me read different types of opinions, they will actually actively seek out information that just validates what they already believe. And why this is an issue is when we're trying to get people to follow social distancing rules and to be more aware about public health in ways that they haven't been before. Instead, we have this tidal wave of information that people have to make sense of. And in some senses, it's making people become even more to double down on their belief, because there's so much information out there that they have to think about. And in particular, with confirmation bias, usually people are going to reject something that requires them to do things a little bit differently. So if you really don't want to wear a mask, then you're going to start to believe conspiracy theories that they don't work or that it's an invasion of privacy, instead of actually looking at, well, maybe let's read more about collective rights. Let's read about what the legislation says about public health orders. Let me try and understand why wearing a mask protects the people I love. It's not, you're not taking something from me by asking me to wear a mask. I'm actually protecting the people that I love and my community. So the idea of confirmation bias is people are just so used to now, particularly social media hasn't changed this, it's just amplified what people were already doing, which is people prefer to get into arguments we talk about voicing our opinion, but really we're just voicing our biases. So my article was trying to look at ways to help the public to maybe unpack their own beliefs. And there are lots of tips that we can think about, but very basically, if you want to sort of test your own confirmation bias, I would encourage your audience to think about what's one thing that they believe is true about COVID-19. And a really quick way to check your own confirmation bias is to say to yourself, why do I believe this? Where did I get this information from? Whose interest does it serve? And does it serve the status quo? So if you think about that checklist for people who might believe that I don't need to wear a mask, if they think about where did they get that information, they did not get it from doctors. They did not get it from scientific experts on health. So you can already start to see, okay, maybe I'm being drawn into confirmation bias here. If they think about the question around, whose interest does it serve? What happens if I wear a mask? I protect the people I love. I protect nurses, I protect doctors. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You know, if I don't wear a mask, whose interest does it serve? Well, actually, it's going to mean that people around me are going to get sick, and that I might get sick, that my grandparents might get sick and actually die. Is it the status quo? Well, at the moment, not wearing a mask has really big implications. It'll mean that the pandemic will just be protracted. It will be drawn out for a lot longer. Is that something that people really want? If they are upset that they have to wear a mask when they go shopping now, think about how upset they'll be if they have to keep wearing a mask for another 2 years.
Mm-hmm. I like how you go down that list, and at the same time being the devil's advocate of thinking about how other people think. This is not my view, but other people would say, well, I heard from this epidemiologist on Facebook or on YouTube, and then I heard that it serves the interest actually of, say, the people who have the power and have the money, like the Bill Gates or the whomever, that they feel like are trying to make money off of people by a vaccine. I mean, those are the big things. And then the 5G, that's part of the whole thing, to really surveil or to control, and there was even something about a chip that wasn't really part of the real study, that people are saying, well, that can be injected and then they can follow you around and know where you go. So those are the things that are being floated around as actually real things. And so when we go down that list, how do we know what's credible and not credible as far as sources?
Well, yes, it's a great question. And I think many people fall into this trap. I actually engaged a very well-known journalist who was on Twitter, basically having a conversation with his followers, saying, COVID is a disease of the privileged. And he was going back and forth with his followers. And I said, okay, where did you get this information? So I went through the checklist, basically. Which scientific study was cited? What do you mean by privilege? And he said, oh, here's an example. And he linked to a media story on a credible news site, which is ABC News. And then I said, well, that study doesn't actually say what you just said. Where does it say? Like, point me where it doesn't even mention the word privilege, not once. And I said, where are the scientific studies? It doesn't reference any scientific studies. They've just got quotes from different experts. But I said, for example, this is an old news story from May. And with the pandemic, information, as we were talking about earlier, it changes pretty much every day. But when you ask random experts, I know that it's hard. It's hard for the public to think, well, this person's a doctor, or this person's an epidemiologist. And then because we have so much information that we're trying to make sense of, we might have forgotten. So some of the things that people can look to is, well, if they haven't linked to an actual scientific study, that's a first red flag for you, that it's probably just someone's opinion. I've got a PhD and I can have an opinion about masks and whether or not this mask is better than that mask. But unless I'm looking to a scientific study that you yourself can go back to and try and work through, then you probably shouldn't believe me, because it's going to be the same as asking, somebody who works at a convenience store what they think about masks. Right?
Right.
So
I think even in your article, you had cited something, and I'm trying to remember what it was. There was a study that the media, there was some journalist or some media outlet that took from a study and they misunderstood it. And so do you recall which one that was? Can you tell us about that?
Yes. So that was a study by Paletti and colleagues, so an Italian scientist. And they were looking at one region in Italy, Lombardy, and they were looking at which age groups have a lower probability of developing COVID-19. So the abstract says that young people in Lombardy have a lower probability of developing COVID-19. And then the media picked this up as saying, kids can't get COVID-19. So
from this study, that's where that came from.
Yeah.
That's our belief. So then that's all of our belief is from this study that was misread.
That was one of the studies. Yes, one of the studies, and then that led to an extrapolation again. So you can see how we've already gone very far away. The study says probability of developing COVID-19. So probability is different than certainty, right? And then the next step is to interpret that to mean kids can't get COVID-19. To the next phase, which is what the media picked up, was it's safe to reopen schools. And that is not what the study says at all. So if you were to, what happens with media stories is sometimes they'll report it and they're very rarely, unfortunately, very rarely linked to the original study. So it is harder for the lay person to then, because how are you going to Google it? You know, like if you don't understand the scientific literature, which is why in these instances, it's so important for the public to maybe move away from just consuming media from narrow sources. There are so many researchers, scientists who are putting out really plain language, valuable information and trying to increase scientific literacy of the public. So in this case, what scientists did is on social media, they actually looked at the original study and it actually showed that, well, the abstract said one thing and then the media had misinterpreted the information. And that we need to think about things like, what was the original study looking at? So that's the first thing you need to think about. So what was the original intent of the study? You need to think about sample. Did they use, for example, a randomized sample where everybody in society had an equal chance of being included in the study? Or have they just focused on a narrow group of people? And in fact, most studies that have been misinterpreted to say that kids have a lower rate of infection, you should treat them with caution because a lot of them are looking at very narrow sample sets. And it's fine. It's fine for studies to focus on specific sample sizes if that's what they're trying to look at. The problem is in interpreting that small subset can be extrapolated to say something about the disease more broadly. And if you look at the original studies, they always have a limitation section that tells the reader, if you're going to interpret our findings, this is what you need to know. And in that particular study, it was really looking at the fact that children are much less likely to have overt symptoms of COVID. And that's what keeps coming up again and again in scientific studies. It's not that kids are less likely to spread it necessarily. It's that kids have been underdiagnosed because they have milder symptoms. We are so used to seeing kids pick up, you know, a cough or a sniffle, and parents think that that's just, you know, you'll shake it off, it's just a bug. When in fact, what looks more likely is that kids are picking up the virus, but they're being misdiagnosed or underdiagnosed. And that's certainly the case in many cities, including in the second wave of Wuhan, where because kids who were being tested, for example, there, they were using a different method. They were using, you know, temperature checks, which is not as accurate as the nasal swabs. And there are other tests that have been developed, saliva tests as well, which are good for kids, but they're not as accurate as the nasal swab. Nasal swabs are uncomfortable, and so parents also don't want their kids to go through that. So we need to think about, well, when they're looking at the sample, what are the specifics of the group that they were studying? What were they actually set out to find? None of these studies have actually have actually set out to prove that it's safe for kids to be back at school. What scientists are trying to work out is rate of infection. They're trying to work out how does COVID-19 present in different subgroups. And so if you come across a study or you hear somebody talking about a study, always worth, maybe, those academic papers are hard to read at the best of times. A lot of it is technical language, but that's why it's good to start looking at what other scientists are saying. Start reading that as part of your daily reading. Don't necessarily just rely on mainstream media, because they already, some of those reports are biased because the media is biased. But scientists have a broader commitment to working out how the virus is actually spreading. They're not motivated as a whole. The scientific community is not motivated by money or any of these, conspiracy theories. They're just trying to work out what's happening live in real time. That's what constantly re-updating what we think we know, and we're testing different hypotheses. And so the public needs to understand that and needs to know that there are scientists who will answer your specific questions. If you write to them on Twitter, on Facebook, they will answer your questions. And it's much better to go to someone like that than to, tune into some random person giving their personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. And we have to look at the fact that there are some people who want to open schools for
Exactly.
certain reasons, political reasons, economic reasons, mainly a lot of political reasons. And so they'll take a study like that and say, oh, well, this fits. So we can hold it up and say, here's why we can open schools. But as we see now, schools are opening and infections are happening. And so if we can look back and kind of reverse engineer how these belief systems came to be, where they took the information and waved it, that now we can see where how they're taking these sources and they're utilizing it. So we have to be a skeptic in a sense, and we have to look at everything as, is this true? And let's look beyond what the sensational headline is and what's being put out there. Because I know, being somebody from the media, that there is a headline, and a responsible reporter will do the responsible thing and put the real study information in there. But I can't say every media person and source that they're getting it from is responsible in feeding even that reporter the right information sometimes. So, I don't want to step on any toes or anything like that. That's why I'm hesitating. But what we need to do is to be responsible for our own information, it sounds like you're saying. And really, who we can trust are the people who are doing the work, the actual studies, and to look for that study. Then what I do is I take that study name and I Google it, and I try to find the actual study. And then I look down even beyond the abstract. Sometimes you see the abstract, which is sort of a summation of the study. And you'll say, okay, I got the gist, but now let me see really what they were what they were trying to prove. Does it have anything to do with that thing in the article that could have been kind of formed to prove a point in the article? Because there's always a point. I guess some people say it's biased. Well, there's a point that's trying to be proved, and sometimes that things get utilized to prove that point.
One of the questions is around, is this reliable, right? So is the science reliable? And that for us means, can we replicate, can we take these findings and apply them to everyone? That's the point I made about sample sizes. If the sample was very narrow, there are lots of reasons why we need to look at narrow samples when we're trying to build our theories and develop our ideas. And sometimes it's valid to look at a narrow group. If, for example, we need to look at people who are more vulnerable to dying from COVID. But then we look at the limitations of those methods. So if they've looked at a narrow population, that probably tells you that it can't be applied to everybody. So we can't extrapolate from these findings to everyone. And so think about those methods. Do the abstract methods and conclusions match? And then the other thing is validity. Did the researcher do what they set out to find? So what was their research question to begin with? That's always clear. That's always plain to see. And then do their conclusions match that? It happens, but it's rare for scientists to make those big leaps. That's why we say, you know, big claims require big evidence. So if they're saying something that's outside of what the scientific community already believes, then they better back it up with amazing data. So if they're saying it is 100% safe to reopen schools, you know that that study is saying something that the rest of the scientific community around the world has not agreed on. And so that's a red flag for you. You've got to think about your critical thinking questions, because the likelihood that a study is going to prove that conclusively is very low. And we know that because work around the world is showing that the outcomes at schools are, it's not that simple. And in fact, we would be very surprised by anything that was able to prove that it's 100% safe to send kids back to school. And it's the same sort of method you can use with any of the other big claims you're hearing about COVID. Anyone who says, for example, this is the cure, inject this substance, or do this and you'll never get COVID, that's a red flag, because the entire scientific community has agreed that we still don't understand how this virus behaves. We don't know the long-term outcomes. We are seeing patterns of associated with chronic illness for people who get sick and even after recovery. So that tells us already that this virus, we don't know enough about it. So when there are big claims, then that's where you've got to think about, what are the methods? What were their research questions? Do the conclusions match what they set out to do? Is the sample representative? And then when you're hearing media stories that seem to be very too good to be true, or which are sort of serving the interests of people in power, elite groups, or only serving the interests of some, then that's another red flag where we've got to think about, well, maybe I need to get other perspectives on this study and on this issue. Let me look at what other scientists are saying. There are lots of amazing podcasts and social media accounts that are out there. And one of the quick tests is actually, is that person followed by other scientists? You'll see, because scientists will call each other out. That's what science is about. We're constantly debating. And because there have been examples of, there are some people who set themselves as experts on COVID, and you will see that the scientists will be there in the comments constantly saying, that's not true, that's not true, that's not true. So, you know, have a think about how the scientific community is reacting to different experts, because it's another really good red flag to think more critically.
Mm-hmm. And when we're looking at all that, we have to realize that this is an ongoing thing that scientists are not sure about, and to be okay with that too, because there are at this moment no definitive answers. And I think we all have to be wary of those definitive answers when it wraps it up too neatly. And
exactly.
that sounds like, oh, of course we want to believe those neatly wrapped packages of answers. It's like, oh, proven. Oh, this secret thing was going on and now it makes sense. But to be okay with the unknown and bits and pieces, sort of like we're an investigator and we're in the middle of a case and we've got this shred, this is actual evidence and this is hearsay. And so like to take all those pieces and to not really know, but just to still, oh, it's getting dark in here, just to be comfortable with, hey, here are the things that we do know and here are the things that are sort of gray area. And so I'm going to operate with this set of knowledge, and tomorrow or in an hour it can change. And to sort of be nimble and flexible with all of that as we move forward, which realizing everyone's in this in the same way. No one knows everything. There's no definitive. And we all are not immune to misinformation or to misunderstanding. And that it doesn't make us wrong or bad or stupid, or if we read something, we're like, oh, that sounds so amazing. And for a second you believe it. And then you have to step back. You know, we all have a tendency to want to find that silver bullet or the answer. So I just, wanted to acknowledge that we shouldn't feel bad that that's our reaction in the very first start of, seeing something. But I just, this is really so helpful, because I think there's not a lot of people who have really thought of, how am I going to figure this out? We just are inundated, and so many of us are overwhelmed. So thank you so much. And I would love to talk to you about more things in the future. I'm sure that we'll have you on the show more for more. There's so many topics that I think you and I can talk about.
It's been so great chatting. It's been amazing. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any last words that you feel compelled to say?
No, but I think in the spirit of where you wrapped us up, the one of the, I guess, opportunities from the pandemic, if you like, is to reignite our inquisitive nature. All of us are inquisitive and curious, and this is a really good time to sort of go back to the way kids look at the world, which is they just ask so many questions. And you're right, we don't know what's happening. Nobody knows that where we're going to end up and how the pandemic will continue to evolve. But it's really good to take our cues from kids and ask basic questions and be humble and ready to change our mindset.
I love that. I love that. Well, it's daytime for you over there. Are you going to be Zooming off somewhere today?
Back to my paid work, yes.
Well, good for you that you have a job that you can go to. That's awesome.
Well, I don't take it for granted.
Yes. Yay. So nice to meet you. Thank you for your time. This is really wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks, Angelina.
See you again. Okay, so do you now feel like you've got a system to think things through critically? Well, I guess I was doing that already. I didn't realize it, but now I feel even better. Okay, well, we're going to go back to those beautiful pictures and photos of the Forest School by Megan Miller. She's a photographer in Maui. And I want to say thank you for being here. It's always wonderful to know that people are watching. I see that you're viewing on the Maui Mama's Facebook page, and I think people are watching on Akaku also. You can see it there. So thanks for being here. Take care, stay safe, and be well. Aloha.
This is a good day as any to start the rebuilding of life. The roads that lay open are many when the old one's gone under the knife. And I can feel the sun on my skin, beginning to thaw from within. Today and not tomorrow, there's no time to borrow. Today is a good day to live. This morning has a clearer light as any to see the horizon in the far. Excuses were two for a penny but they've all gone out the window of this car. And when I feel the wind on my face, all that ever was is a rage. Today and not tomorrow, there's no time to borrow. Today, well, something's gotta give. Today, it's a good day. Today and not tomorrow, there's no time to borrow. Today, well, something's gotta give. Today, it's a good